Tannu Uriankhai is a historic region of the Mongol Empire and, later, the Qing dynasty. The realms of Tannu Uriankhai largely correspond to the Tuva Republic of the Russian Federation, neighboring areas in Russia, and are part of the modern state of Mongolia. Tannu designates the Tannu-ola Mountains in the region. Uriankhai was the Mongolian name for the Tuvans, which meant the people living in the woods. After Outer Mongolia declared independence from the Qing dynasty and Republic of China in the early 20th century, the region of Tannu Uriankhai increasingly came under Russian influence and finally became an independent communist state, the Tuvan People's Republic, which was annexed by the Soviet Union in 1944. Sovereignty over the area has not been officially renounced by the Republic of China, based on the island of Taiwan, since 1949. History. With the fall of the Yuan dynasty in China, Tannu Uriankhai was controlled by the Oirots until the end of the 16th and early 17th centuries. Thereafter, the history of Western Mongolia, and by extension Tannu Uriankhai, is a story of the complex military relations between the Altan Khanate and the Oirots, both competing for supremacy in Western Mongolia. The Qing dynasty established its dominion over Mongolia as a result of intervening in a war between the Oirots and the Khakas, the dominant tribe in the eastern half of Mongolia. In 1691, the Kangxi Emperor accepted the submission of the Khakas at Dolanor in Inner Mongolia and then personally led an army into Mongolia, defeating the Oirots near Ulaanbaatar in 1696. Mongolia was now part of the Qing state. Qing rule over Tuva came more peacefully, not by conquest but by threat. In 1726, the Yongzheng Emperor ordered the Katogoit Khan Bu-Uvarai Bais to accompany a high Qing official to inform the Uriankhais of edicts, in order to prevent something untoward from happening. The Uriankhais appear to have accepted this arrangement without dispute, at least none is recorded. Qing subjugation of the Altai Uriankhai and the Altena Uriankhai occurred later, in 1754, as part of a broader military offensive against the Oirots. Qing administration. The Tannu Uriankhai were reorganized into an administrative system similar to that of Mongolia, with 5 koshuns and 46 or 47 sums. Each koshun was governed by a magistrate nominally appointed by the Qing military governor Tuliastai. In the latter half of the 18th century, the magistrate of Tannu-Bana was placed in charge of the others as governor in recognition of his military service to the dynasty. Until 1872, Tannu-Bana, Salajik-Bana, Tolyin-Bana, Kovsgol-Nur-Bana, Kumchik-Bana, Uliastai General 25 sums, Zizatu Khan 5 sums, Sain Noyun Hoso Prince 13 sums, Jet Sundam Barkatub Chus Shabanar 3 sums. Tannu Uriankhai occupied a unique position in the Qing dynasty's frontier administration system. If Qing statutes rigorously defined procedures to be followed by the nobles of Outer and Inner Mongolia, Dzungaria, and Qinghai for rendering tribute, receiving government stipends, and participating in imperial audiences, they are silent regarding Tannu Uriankhai. After the demarcation of the Sino-Russian border by the Treaty of Kyakhta, the Qing inexplicably placed border guards south of the Tannu-ola Mountains, separating Tannu Uriankhai from Outer Mongolia, not along the Sine Mountains separating the region from Russia. The Qing military governor Tuliastai, on his triennial inspection tours of the 24 pickets under his direct supervision, never crossed the Tannu-ola Tannu-ola Mountains to visit Uriankhai. When problems occurred meriting official attention, the military governor would send a Mongol from his staff rather than attend to the matter himself. Indeed, there is no evidence that Tannu-Uriankhai was ever visited by a senior king official. Chinese merchants were forbidden to cross the pickets, a law not lifted until the turn of the 20th century. Instead, a few days were set aside for trade at Uliastai when Uriankhai nobles delivered their annual fur tribute to the military governor and received the salaries and other imperial gifts from the emperor. Thus, Tannu-Uriankhai enjoyed a degree of political and cultural autonomy unequaled on the Chinese frontier. Russian settlement of the region began in 1839 with the opening of 2 gold mines in the Tannu Mountains. In the following decades, other areas were exploited for mining, mainly in the northern part of Uriankhai. By 1883 the total number of Russian miners that reached 485. Russian merchants from Minuzinsk followed, especially after the Treaty of Peking in 1860, which opened China to foreign trade. They were lured by the wild prices, as one 19th-century Russian writer described them, that Uriankhais were willing to pay for Russian-manufactured goods, cloth, haberdashery, samovars, knives, tobacco, etc. By the end of the 1860s there were already 16 commercial establishments in Tannu-Uriankhai. The Uriankhais paid for these goods in livestock on the hoof, furs, and animal skins. But crossing the Tannu Mountains was a journey not without hardships, and even peril. Thus, by 1880–85 there were perhaps no more than 50 Russian traders operating in Tannu-Uriankhai during the summer, when trade was most active. Russian colonization followed. It started in 1856 with a sect of old believers called the Seekers of White Waters, a place which according to the tradition was isolated from the rest of the world by impassable mountains and forests, where they could obtain refuge from government authorities and where the Nikon rites of the Russian Orthodox Church were not practiced. In the 1860s a different kind of refugee arrived, those fleeing from penal servitude in Siberia. More Russians came. Small settlements were formed in the northern and central parts of Tuva. The formal beginning of Russian colonization in Tannu-Uriankhai occurred in 1885, when a merchant received permission from the Governor-General of Irkutsk to farm at present-day Turan. Other settlements were formed, and by the first decade of the 20th century there were perhaps 2,000 merchants and colonists. By the late 1870s and in the 1880s the Russian presence had acquired a political content. In 1878 Russians discovered gold in eastern Uriankhai. There were rumors of fabulous wealth to be gained from this area, and the Russian provincial authorities at Yeniseisk were deluged with petitions from gold miners to mine. Merchants and miners petitioned Russian authorities for military and police protection. In 1886 the Uzinsk Frontier Superintendent was established, its primary function to represent Russian interests in Tannu-Uriankhai with Uriankhai nobles and to issue passports to Russians traveling in Uriankhai. Over the years this office was to quietly but steadily claim the power of government over at least the Russians in the region. Taxation, policing, administration, and justice, powers that should have belonged to, but were effectively relinquished by, the king. Shortly after the office of superintendent was created, the Sibirskaya Gazeta brought out a special edition, congratulating the government on its creation creation, and predicting that all Tannu-Uriankhai would someday become part of the Russian state. As a general observation, the Tsarist government had been reluctant to act precipitously in Uriankhai for fear of arousing the king. It generally preferred a less obvious approach, one that depended on colonization rather than military action, and it is this that fundamentally distinguished ultimate Russian dominion over Tannu-Uriankhai from that of Outer Mongolia, with which it has often been compared. In the former, the Russians were essentially colonists. In the latter, they were traders. The Russians built permanent farmhouses in Uriankhai, opened land for cultivation, erected fences, and raised livestock. They were there to stay. What gave the Russian presence added durability was its concentration in the northern and central parts of Tannu-Uriankhai, areas sparsely populated by the natives themselves. It was Russian colonization, therefore, rather than purposeful Tsarist aggression, that resulted in Tannu-Uriankhai ultimately becoming part of Russia in the following century. Qing reaction. The Qing government was not oblivious to the Russian presence. In the 1860s and 1870s, the Uliastai military governor on a number of occasions reported to Peking on the movement of Russians into Uriankhai. Its suspicions were further aroused by other events, at negotiations between it and Russia resulting in the Tar-Bagatai Protocol of 1864, which defined a part of the Sino-Russian border. The Russian representative insisted that all territory to the north of the Qing frontier pickets fall to Russia. Moreover, the Uliastai military governor obtained a Russian map showing the Tannu-ola Mountains as the Sino-Russian border. But in the second half of the 19th century, the Qing government was far too distracted by internal problems to deal with this. Instead, it was left to local officials on the frontier to manage the Russians as best they could, an impossible task without funds or troops. The military governors at Uliastai had to be content with limp protests and inconclusive investigations. End of Qing rule. By the early 20th century, the Uriankhai economy had seriously deteriorated, resulting in the increasing poverty of its people. The causes were varied. Declining number of fur-bearing animals, probably due to overhunting by both Uriankhais and Russians. Declining number of livestock as a result of the export market to Siberia, and periodic natural disasters, which took a fearful toll on livestock herds. There was another reason. Uriankhai trade with Russians was conducted on credit using a complex system of valuation principally pegged to squirrel skins. As the number of squirrels declined because of overhunting, the price of goods increased. The Russians also manipulated the trade by encouraging credit purchases at usurious rates of interest. If repayment were not forthcoming, Russian merchants would drive off the livestock either of the debtor or of his relatives or friends. This resulted in retaliatory raids by the Uriankhai. The situation worsened when the Chinese came. Although the king had successfully kept Chinese traders out of Uriankhai, in 1902 they were allowed to cross the border to counter Russian domination of the Uriankhai economy. By 1910 there were 30 of the shops, all branches of Chinese firms operating in Uliastai. For a host of reasons, more aggressive selling, easier credit terms, cheaper and more popular goods for sale, the Chinese soon dominated commerce just as they had in Mongolia. Soon, the Uriankhais, commoners and princes alike, had accumulated large debts to the Chinese. The end of Qing rule in Tannu-Uriankhai came quickly. On October 10, 1911, the revolution to overthrow the king broke out in China. and soon afterwards Chinese provinces followed one another in declaring their independence. The Outer Mongolians declared their own independence of China on December 1 and expelled the king viceroy 4 days later. In the second half of December, bands of Uriankhai began plundering and burning Chinese shops. Uriankhai nobles were divided on their course of political action. The Uriankhai governor, Gombo Dorji, advocated becoming a protectorate of Russia, hoping that the Russians in turn would appoint him governor of Uriankhai. But the princes of two other Koshuns preferred to submit to the new Outer Mongolian state under the theocratic rule of the Jebstuns Ambakutuktu of Urga. Undeterred, Gombo Dorji sent a petition to the frontier superintendent at Uzinsk stating that he had been chosen as leader of an independent Tannu Uriankhai state. He asked for protection, and proposed that Russian troops be sent immediately into the country to prevent China from restoring its rule over the region. There was no reply. 3 months earlier, the Tsarist Council of Ministers had already decided on a policy of gradual, cautious absorption of Uriankhai by encouraging Russian colonization. Precipitous action by Russia, the council feared, might provoke China. This position changed, however, as a result of pressure from commercial circles in Russia for a more activist approach, and a Russian-sponsored petition from 2 Uriankhai Koshuns in the fall of 1913 requesting to be accepted as a part of Russia. Other Uriankhai Koshuns soon followed suit. In April 1914, Tannu Uriankhai was formally accepted as a protectorate of Russia.